This is K.M. Weiland, and you're listening to the 69th episode of the Wordplay Podcast. I have an odd sense of perfectionism. I'm an obsessive neatnik, a place for everything and everything in its place. But I have a hard time caring about the dust collecting in the windowsills or the spider webs lurking under the heat register. Most of the time, my writing falls squarely into the first category, the obsessive, get-everything right category. But that's a hard category for any first drafts to fit into. I have every intention of making my first drafts as spanking clean as they can be. I go back and dust the corners and sweep away the spiderwebs, fix that typo, correct that dangling participle. But have you ever noticed that in order to clean something, you have to make a bigger mess first? Whenever I clean my closet, the rest of the room always ends up looking like Hurricane Katrina went through. That's kind of what my first draft of The Deepest Breath looks like right now. I'm scattering scenes and characters and making a big fat mess, because I know that in the end, everything will be all the cleaner because of it. Don't forget that my blog tour for my CD, Conquering Writer's Block and Summoning Inspiration, is ongoing. This week, Charmaine Clancy and Lorna Poston will be interviewing me on their respective sites. Stop by my blog at wordplay-kmweiland, that's weiland.blogspot.com, to access the links. Never give characters what they want. The latest post in the video series on my blog shows how George Eliot delayed gratification to keep readers turning the 800 pages of her masterpiece, Middlemarch. You can watch the video on my blog. New videos are posted every Wednesday. Meanwhile, enjoy this week's podcast. Is your dialogue pulling its weight? Dialogue is one of the hardest working components in fiction, but only if we take full advantage of it. It's easy enough to make our characters talk to each other, and even relatively easy enough to make what they say interesting to the reader. But if interesting is the only burden our dialogue is carrying, it's not doing its share. So just what is dialogue really capable of? One of the best places to study this subject is your local movie theater. Because movies don't have the option of utilizing narrative, except for the occasional subtitle or voiceover, they're forced to rely on dialogue to carry the bulk of information. Good dialogue can do the following. Introduce characters. Pay attention to the early scenes in most movies, and you'll notice that the characters inevitably call each other by name. How else would the viewer learn who was who? Example from The Great Escape. John Sturges's classic World War II movie, 1963, has the difficult task of introducing a huge cast of characters, all within the space of the opening sequence. In just the few beginning scenes, the dialogue includes the names of 14 characters, some of them repeated to make sure viewers understand who is who. Introduce settings. One suburban house, desert, prison, ship, etc. looks pretty much like another. So how are viewers to know where the characters are? Some movies and books accomplish this with a brief subtitle at the bottom of the opening screen. For example, Chicago, 1919. But most utilize dialogue. Example from Batman Begins. The opening shot in Christopher Nolan's 2005 movie shows a girl chasing a boy across a garden after he's grabbed an arrowhead from her hand. Thanks to the few lines of dialogue, we know exactly where these characters are. The girl says, "Finders keepers, and I found it." And the boy responds, "In my garden." Convey a character's background. How a character's speech is shaped, both his accent and his word choices, gives the author an immediately powerful opportunity to tell the reader or viewer something about the character. Example from Oliver. Carol Reed's 1968 Oscar-winning musical adaptation of Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist leaves no room for doubt about the Artful Dodger's seedy background, thanks to his opening line of dialogue. "What you staring at? Ain't you never seen a toff?" Show a character's emotional landscape. Fiction writers could easily spend pages upon pages explaining what their characters may be thinking or feeling at any moment, but a skillful use of dialogue allows us to show these things, and usually in much less space. Example from The Last of the Mohicans. This lush historical movie, directed by Michael Mann, 1992, leaves no room for doubt about the main characters' feelings for each other, thanks to 2 short lines of dialogue. "What are you looking at, sir?" "I'm looking at you, miss." Reveal backstory. Backstory works best when it isn't allowed to take over the main story. Flashbacks are fine and well, but dialogue can often impart the same amount of info in significantly fewer words. Example from Star Wars: A New Hope. Obi-Wan Kenobi sums up Darth Vader's history, which, 30 years later, would take director George Lucas 3 more movies to illustrate, in a few simple lines. A young Jedi named Darth Vader, who was a pupil of mine until he turned to evil, helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi Knights. He betrayed and murdered your father. Now the Jedi are all but extinct. Vader was seduced by the dark side of the Force. Impart necessary information. Writers are always warned against info dumping, but sometimes we have large chunks of information that we simply must explain to the reader if he's to have any chance of understanding the story. Used correctly, and always avoiding the as-you-already-know Bob pitfall of explaining things to characters who already understand the information. Dialogue comes in handy in these instances. Example from Jurassic Park. Steven Spielberg's 1993 blockbuster had the ginormous task of explaining how to clone a dinosaur in a way viewers would understand and accept, without boring them out of their seats. He managed to cleverly weave the necessary info throughout the movie's dialogue without resorting to the pages of explanation required in the original novel by Michael Crichton. Dialogue is too valuable a commodity for us to neglect. These are just a few of the ways we can make sure it's pulling its weight in our stories. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, visit me on the web at wordplay-kmwyland, that's weiland.blogspot.com, and be sure to listen again next week.